Pap's escape from Roman custody and subsequent murder. In the midst of the disturbances arising from the atrocious murder of the King of the Quadi by a perfidious general, a dreadful crime was committed in the east, where Pap, the King of Armenia, was the victim of a treacherous plot. I have ascertained the origin of the iniquitous design, which was this. Some cunning men, who had often enriched themselves at the expense of the public, patched together and brought to Valen's notice in a wickedly exaggerated form a number of charges against Pap, who was still in his early manhood. Among them was the General Terentius, a man who always went about with a humble and dejected look, but was all his life a keen instigator of discord. He allied himself with a few of Pap's countrymen, who lived in dread of punishment for their crimes, and wrote constantly to the court, harping on the deaths of Silasses and Arabanes, and stressing the arrogant behaviour of the young king, and his cruelty to his subjects. So, on the pretence that he was needed to take part in a conference on the current situation, Pap was invited to court in terms befitting his dignity, but kept in custody at Tarsus in Cilicia by what was ostensibly a guard of honour. He could not obtain access to the emperor, or learn why he had been sent for so urgently, since all about him were silent on the matter. Finally, however, he discovered through a private channel that Terentius was urging the Roman ruler by letter to lose no time in sending another king to Armenia, otherwise hatred of Pap and fear of his return might cause a people serviceable to us to go over to the Persians, who were on fire to seize Armenia by force or threats or cajolery. Once he knew that he had been tricked, Pap realised that a sad end awaited him, and that his only hope of escape lay in rapid flight. On the advice of friends he could trust, he got together 300 men with fast horses, who had accompanied him from his own land. Then, acting with more boldness than discretion, as men often do in dangerous and alarming situations, he set out with the whole troop in the late afternoon, and hastened away undaunted. The governor of the province, alerted by a message from the officer on guard at the gate, hurried after Pap, and overtook him in the suburbs. His earnest entreaties that Pap should stay went unheeded, and he had to turn back in fear of his life. Nor was this all. When a little later a legion followed and overtook him, Pap himself headed a charge of his best men back upon them. Directing a shower of arrows deliberately wide of the mark, he routed his pursuers so thoroughly that the whole body with its commander retreated in panic to the walls a good deal more smartly than it had set out. Pap's fears were now dispelled, and after an exhausting march of 2 days and nights he reached the Euphrates. He had no boats, so could not cross the river, which is too deep to be forded. Most of his followers could not swim and were terror-struck, and the king himself was more perplexed than any. He would have had to remain there if, among all the various suggestions made to him, he had not hit upon an expedient which seemed the safest in this desperate situation. He took the beds to be found in the farmhouses, and fastened upon each 2 inflated skins, of which there was an abundance in that country of vineyards. The prince himself and his leading men had one of these rafts apiece, and led their horses behind them. By taking an oblique course, they avoided having to contend with the current and its choppy waves, and after encountering extreme danger succeeded in reaching the opposite bank, All the rest clung to their swimming mounts. They were tossed about and frequently submerged by the swirling river, but finally thrown on the opposite bank, exhausted by their wetting and its attendant dangers. There they took a short rest, and then went on more rapidly than on the preceding days. The Emperor was deeply disturbed by the news of Pap's flight, believing that now that he had escaped from the snare, he would repudiate his allegiance. So he sent Count Daniel and Barzimares, the tribune of the Scutari, with 1,000 lightly equipped bowmen, to bring him back. Their local knowledge enabled them to take shortcuts through the valleys and head off the king, who, being a stranger and ignorant of the country, was taking a meandering and circuitous route. Dividing their forces, they blocked the two nearest roads, which were 3 miles apart, so that whichever he took, he would be caught unawares. But this plan was frustrated by an accident. A traveller who was hurrying westwards had seen both roads blocked by troops, and in order to avoid them, he had taken an intermediate track overgrown with bushes and brambles. He fell in with the exhausted Armenians, and was brought to their king, to whom he revealed privately what he had seen. He was detained but suffered no harm. The king hid his anxiety and secretly sent a horseman by the right-hand road, with orders to secure lodging and food. A little later, a second was sent post-haste by the road to the left with identical orders, quite unaware of the errand of the first. After these salutary precautions, the traveller, retracing his steps, showed Pap and his men a rough path, almost too narrow for a pack animal, by which the king left the troops behind and made his escape. The soldiers captured his messengers, who had been sent merely to confuse them, and were expecting his own arrival with open arms like hunters waiting for their quarry. But in the meantime he was restored safe to his kingdom, where he received a rapturous welcome. Thereafter his loyalty remained unshaken, but he digested in silence the wrongs he had suffered. Daniel and Barzimares returned baffled, to be loaded with insults and reproaches for their slackness and lack of spirit, like poisonous snakes whose teeth have been blunted in an initial attack. They sharpened their deadly fangs anew, intending to take the first opportunity of doing all the harm in their power to the man who had eluded them, to mitigate their guilt, or rather to explain away the trick that had been played on them by superior intelligence. They bombarded the Emperor, whose ears were most retentive of gossip, with false accusations about Pap. They concocted a story that, like Circe, he was wonderfully adept at transforming and weakening men's bodies by spells. These arts had enabled him to pass through their ranks by wrapping himself in darkness and changing the shape of himself and his men, and if he were allowed to get away with this trick, he would be a source of sad troubles. By these means the Emperor's implacable hatred of Pap was intensified. Every day, a fresh scheme was devised to take away his life, either by force or fraud, and secret instructions to this effect were sent to Trajan, who at that time was commanding in Armenia. This man employed a confidence trick to insinuate himself into the king's favour, occasionally showing him a letter from Valens as proof that the emperor was kindly disposed towards him, and at other times making himself at home at the king's table. Finally, when his plans were matured, he invited Pap in the most respectful terms to a banquet. The king came, quite unsuspecting, and was seated in a place of honour. The choicest food was set before him, and the great building rang with vocal and instrumental music. When drinking was well under way, the host left the room, ostensibly to answer a call of nature, and a wild barbarian guardsman was sent in, glaring ferociously and brandishing a drawn sword, to kill the young man. Every way of escape had already been barred. The prince, who happened to be leaning forward from his place, drew his dagger and jumped up to defend himself as best he could, but he was run through the heart, and fell a hideous victim foully slaughtered by repeated blows. By this act of treachery, simple credulity was wickedly abused. Under the very eyes of the god who protects guests, and at a banquet whose sanctity would be respected even by the dwellers by the Black Sea, the blood of a stranger was spilt over the fine table linen. This gory sight was more than enough for the guests, who scattered in the utmost horror. If those who have departed from life can feel grief, this outrage might well draw a groan from the great Fabricius Lucinus, as he recalls with what magnanimity he rejected the proposal made to him in secret by Demochares, or as some say Nicias, the servant of King Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus was laying Italy waste with fire and sword, and Demochares vowed that he would poison him by means of his drink. But Fabricius warned the king by letter to be on his guard against his personal attendants. Such was the sanctity which in those good old times attached to the conventional table even of an enemy. It is true that some flatterers attempted to justify this recent, unheard of and shameful crime by the example of the assassination of Sertorius. Presumably they did not know that a wrongful act is not justified by the fact that another similar wrongful act has gone unpunished. For this we have the authority of Demosthenes, the eternal glory of Greece. Negotiations between Valens and Sapor. Such were the extraordinary events in Armenia. But Sapor was deeply afflicted by the news of Pap's death, coming as it did after his own earlier reverse. He had been making strenuous efforts to win over Pap, and his alarm was increased by the activity of our army, so by way of preparation for a greater undertaking he sent Araces on a mission to the emperor, urging him completely to abandon Armenia, which was a perpetual source of trouble. If this was not acceptable, he proposed as an alternative that the division of Iberia should be cancelled, the garrisons of the Roman sector withdrawn, and Aspicures, whom he had himself made king of that people, allowed to rule alone. Valens replied that he could not deviate from an arrangement made by common consent, and that he would spare no pains to maintain it. Toward the end of winter, this haughty answer provoked a counterblast from the king, full of empty verbiage. He maintained that the root causes of disagreement could not be extirpated without the participation of the witnesses to the treaty with Jovian, some of whom he knew to be dead. These exchanges made matters worse, and the emperor, who was better at choosing between different options than at devising them, decided that the best policy was to order Victor, master of cavalry, and Urbicinus, the commander of Mesopotamia, to go at once to the Persians with a quite unambiguous message to the effect that it was criminal in a king who prided himself on being upright and content with his own possessions to covet Armenia, whose inhabitants had been left to choose their own way of life, unless the troops assigned for the protection of Sarmaces were allowed to return unhindered at the beginning of the following year in accordance with the agreement. Sapor would have to do under compulsion what he had omitted to do voluntarily. This was frank and straightforward enough, but the envoys went astray in one particular. They exceeded their commission by taking under their protection some small districts of Armenia, which offered themselves to them. On their return to Serena, whose position is inferior only to the king's, came and offered to the emperor these same districts that our envoy had been rash enough to accept. He was given a magnificent reception, but went away empty-handed. Great preparations were then made for war. The emperor's intention was to invade Persia in 3 columns as soon as the weather moderated, and with this in mind, he lost no time in hiring auxiliaries from Scythia. Sapor, finding his hopes unfulfilled and exasperated beyond his wont by the news that the emperor was preparing for a campaign, defied Valens' anger, and entrusted to the Serena the task of retrieving by force if necessary the territories accepted by Count Victor and Urbicinus. He was also to do all he could to harass the troops detailed to protect Sarmaces. These instructions were at once carried out, and there was nothing that we could do to counter them or exact retribution, because another danger now threatened the Roman state. The entire Gothic people was overrunning Thrace as they pleased, a catastrophic event of which I will give a brief account in its proper place. Such were the events in the East. In the course of them, the unfailing energy of justice exacted retribution for the disasters in Africa, and avenged at last the restless ghosts of the envoys from Triopolis. For justice, though she is sometimes slow, is a rigorous judge of good and bad actions. What happened was this. Remigius, who, as I related earlier, had supported Count Romanus in his depredations on the provinces, was succeeded as master of the office by Leo, and in retirement devoted himself to country pursuits in his native place near Mainz. His return to a carefree private life excited the contempt of the Praetorian prefect Maximin, who made it his object to injure him in any way he could, like the abominable mischief-maker he always was. Hoping to bring further secrets to light, he subjected Caesarius, a former servant of Remigius, and later an imperial notary, to a savage interrogation, inquiring about Remigius' conduct and asking how much he had got for abetting the infamous behaviour of Romanus. This came to Remigius' ears while he was, as I said, in retirement, and either from consciousness of guilt or because fear of his enemies' intrigues got the better of his reason, he put his neck in a noose and hanged himself. Valentinian makes peace with Macrianus. Next year Gratian became consul, with Equitius as his colleague. Valentinian devastated several districts in Germany and was in the act of building a fort near Basel, when he received from the prefect Probus a report of the disasters in Illyricum. He gave this the attention of a cautious commander, and in a state of considerable anxiety sent the notary Paternian to make a searching investigation. As soon as he received through him a true account of the affair, he was eager to set out at once, intending to crush at the first onset the barbarians who had dared to violate our frontier. But since autumn was almost over and the project was attended by many difficulties, all the leading men at court did everything in their power to prevail upon him to postpone operations until the beginning of spring. They urged that the roads were frost-bound and that grass fit for fodder and other supplies would be unprocurable. They reminded him too of the savage temper of the kings on the borders of Gaul, and especially of Macrianus, who was an object of dread at that time, and who, if he were left unpacified, would undoubtedly attack even fortified cities. By these representations and other helpful advice, the emperor was won over to a better course, and on the interest of the state, a courteous invitation to come to the vicinity of Mainz was sent at once to the aforesaid king, who was himself clearly inclined to come to terms. he arrived in a mood of prodigious self-confidence, expecting that he would have the last word in the negotiations. On the day appointed for the conference, he stood majestically erect on the very bank of the Rhine, while his countrymen clashed their shields around him. From the other side, the emperor, also attended by a host of officers of various ranks amid a display of gleaming standards, embarked in some river boats and came to a safe distance from the shore. When the frantic gesticulations and chatter of the barbarians at last died down, there was much exchange of talk from both sides, and a pact of friendship was concluded and confirmed by solemn oaths. The king, who had been such a source of trouble, then withdrew mollified. From that time he was to prove our ally, and up to the very end of his life gave ample proof of his steadfast loyalty by his noble behaviour. At a later date he perished in the land of the Franks, where he advanced too rashly in the course of a sanguinary raid, and fell into a trap set by the warlike king Malobordes. After the solemn ratification of the treaty, Valentinian retired to winter quarters at Trier. A discussion of the practice of advocacy. Such were the events in Gaul and on the northern flank of the empire, but in the east, where our foreign enemies were quiescent, the ruin of the state from within was hastened by the friends and intimates of Valens, who subordinated honour to their own advantage. They exerted all their influence to deter the emperor, whose stern nature made him more than willing to try lawsuits, from his desire to sit as a judge. They were afraid that, as in the time of Julian, innocence might find a new defender, and a check be placed on the arrogance of the powerful, who had taken advantage of their freedom from control to enlarge the field of their activities. For these and similar reasons, many people united in an attempt to dissuade the emperor. Prominent among them was the Praetorian prefect Modestus, who was the creature of the court eunuchs, and whose artificial manner concealed a Philistine nature unpolished by any study of ancient literature. He declared that the details of private suits were beneath the emperor's notice, and Valens, believing that the duty of examining swarms of cases had been designed to humble the imperial dignity, took Modestus' advice and entirely abandoned the practice. This opened the door to acts of robbery, which grew more outrageous day by day through the criminal collusion of judges and advocates, who sold the interests of the poor to military commanders or persons of influence in the palace, and thereby won for themselves riches and high position. The profession of forensic oratory is defined by the great Plato as a counterfeit branch of the art of government, or as the fourth kind of pandering. Epicurus too calls it a bad skill and regards it as a mischievous activity. Tisius calls it the creator of persuasion and mischievous activity. Gorgias of Leontini agrees with him. The art which early authorities defined in such terms has been made hateful in the eyes of respectable people by the cunning of certain men in the East, and that is why it is restrained by the imposition of a time limit on speakers. Before returning to my main theme, I will give a brief account of its vileness, which I experienced when I lived in those parts. There was a time when tribunals were adorned by pleadings in the refined style then in use, when passionately eloquent speakers who had made a special study of rhetoric rose to eminence by their intellect and probity, and by the fluency and richness of their diction. Such were Demosthenes, who, as we learn from the records of Athens, could always draw a crowd from all over Greece to hear him speak; Callistratus, whose noble speech on the affair of Oropus caused Demosthenes to abandon Plato and the Academy and follow him; Hyperides, Aeschymenes, Androclides, Dinarchus, and the famous Antiphon of Ramnus, who according to a tradition was the first person ever to accept a fee for defending a case. It was the same at Rome. Rutilius and Galba and Saurus were men of outstandingly upright character, and in later generations a number who had been censors or consuls or enjoyed triumphs, Crassus and Anthony, Philippus and Scaevola, and a host of others, after a career in the field crowned by victories and trophies, gained distinction by serving the state in a civil capacity, won laurels by spectacular forensic exploits, and enjoyed the highest possible reputation. After them came Cicero, the greatest of them all. The irresistible flood of his eloquence often rescued the oppressed from the fiery ordeal of a trial, and he was the author of the dictum, "It is perhaps possible to escape reproach for not defending a man, but it is criminal to defend him carelessly." But now all over the East are to be found various types of violent and rapacious men who flit from court to court and haunt the houses of the rich, keeping their noses to the scent like sagacious Spartan or Cretan hounds, until they find the place where a potential lawsuit is lurking. The first of these types consists of those who employ themselves in sowing the seeds of discord, by causing people to enter into a host of recognizances. They besiege the doors of widows and the threshold of the childless, and once they have found a pretext for a quarrel, however slight, they create bitter hatred between friends or relations or connections who are in disagreement. Their vicious passions do not cool with advancing years, as happens in other cases. On the contrary, they grow stronger and stronger. Their irresistible appetite for plunder still leaves them poor, and they use their talent like a dagger, making cunning speeches to corrupt the integrity of judges, whose very title is derived from justice. With these obdurate people, impudence masquerades as freedom, reckless audacity as steadfastness, and a sort of empty verbiage as eloquence. As Cicero declares, it is a scandal that a conscientious judge should be deceived by such egregious ploys. Nothing in the state, he says, ought to be freer from corruption than the vote and verdict of a judge, so I do not understand why a man who bribes a judge with money should be thought criminal, whereas one who perverts him by a speech may even be praised for it. In my opinion, the man who corrupts a judge's mind by a speech does more harm than the man who does so with money, since no one can influence a man of sense by a bribe, but may do so by words. The second class comprises those who profess a knowledge of jurisprudence, a subject which the conflict of mutually contradictory statutes has entirely vitiated. These men keep a bridle on their tongues and preserve an unbroken silence like mere shadows of themselves. They compose their features to an expression of solemnity like casters of horoscopes or interpreters of the sublime books, and make a profit out of their very yawns. To give an impression of the profundity of their learning, they quote Trabatius and Caecilius and Alphinus and laws of the Aracini and Cyane, which have long been obsolete, buried centuries ago with the mother of Evander. If you allege that you have deliberately murdered your mother, they promise that there are many recondite precedents which will secure you immunity, provided that they are assured that you are a man of substance. Thirdly, there are those who, in order to win distinction in their mischievous trade, wet their venal tongues to attack the truth, and often gain a hearing whenever they choose by their brazen impudence and disgraceful clamour. When the court is already deeply perplexed, they add complications which cannot be disentangled, and make it their business to prevent any peaceful outcome by raising knotty questions to embarrass the judges. When courts are properly conducted, they are temples of justice, but when they are corrupt, they are blind and treacherous pitfalls. Anyone who falls into them will not escape until many years have elapsed, and he has been sucked dry to the very marrow. The fourth and last class is shameless, headstrong, and ignorant. It consists of people who, after prematurely leaving their elementary school, hang about street corners composing comic verses rather than speeches which could be of service in a trial. They haunt the doors of the rich and angle for the delights of a choice table, abandoning themselves to the pursuit of shady gain and hankering for money from any source. They encourage harmless citizens to engage in futile litigation. On the rare occasions when they are allowed to plead, they learn their client's name and the scope of his business only when they are in the actual presence of the judge and the issue is already joined. Then they burst into such a flood of ill-digested irrelevance that their vile outpouring reminds one irresistibly of the howls of Thersites. When they find themselves unable to substantiate their submissions, they take refuge in sheer abuse, and they are sometimes prosecuted and convicted for constantly reviling persons of standing. Some of them are so totally uneducated that they cannot remember even having possessed a law book, and if the name of an early writer is mentioned in cultivated company, they think it is a foreign name for a fish, or some other consumable. If some stranger inquires after an advocate hitherto unknown to him, Marcian, let us say, they all rush to pretend that their name is Marcian. There is no regard for right before their eyes. They have sold themselves without hope of redemption into slavery to greed, and to employ their innate insolence in pursuit of gain in all their skills. Once they have a man in their toils, they entangle him in a web of complications, deliberately holding up his case by taking it in turns to plead sickness. The citation of a single well-known authority requires the preparation of 7 catchpenny preambles. This is a way of creating interminable delays. Finally, when after the passage of days and months and years the parties have been stripped bare and the actual case comes on when it is already long out of date, these leading lights appear with a crowd of ghost advocates in their train. Once they are at the bar and their property or life of the client is in danger, their task should be to save an innocent man from death or disastrous loss. Instead, the opponents confront one another from an age with wrinkled brows and histrionic gestures. All that seems lacking is the flute players kept by Gracchus at his back to time his delivery, until at last, by previous arrangement, the more confident speaker utters a sort of sugary prologue which promises to rival the speeches for Clutinus or Ctesiphon. Everybody is longing for it to end, and finally he reaches the conclusion that after 3 years of this mockery of a trial, the advocates must plead that they are not yet fully briefed. So an adjournment is granted, and the advocates clamour to be paid for all the toil and danger they have undergone in their Herculean labours. All the same, an advocate is liable to a number of disadvantages which an honest man would find it hard to bear. Tempted by the gains to be made from their inglorious calling, they quarrel bitterly among themselves, and, as I have said, offend many people by the outbursts of violent abuse in which they indulge when they have no solid arguments to fortify a weak case. Besides, they sometimes have to do with judges who have been trained in the wise cracks of Philicitron or Aesop rather than in the school of Aristides the Just or Cato. Such men who have paid good money for their official posts are like troublesome creditors and try to recoup their outlay by prying into everybody's resources and wresting from others the spoil they have won. In addition, there is one other serious drawback to the practice of advocacy. It is an inborn characteristic of almost all litigants to think it the fault of their advocate if they lose their case. Although this may happen through any of 1,000 accidents, It is always their advocate, never the weakness of their case, or as often happens, the partiality of the court that is responsible for the result, and their anger is concentrated upon him alone. But now let me return to the point from which I digressed. Valentinian and the Quadi, AD 375. When spring was on its way, Valentinian moved from Trier and marched rapidly over a familiar route. As he approached his destination, he was met by envoys from the Sarmatians. They fell at his feet, begging in propitiatory terms that he would be gracious and merciful, and assuring him that he would find none of their countrymen accessory or privy to any atrocity. In response to their repeated assertions, the emperor replied after mature consideration that these outrages must be investigated and punished in the light of the most reliable evidence in the actual places where they were said to have occurred. He then entered the Illyrian town of Carnutum, which is now abandoned and in ruins, but was then very conveniently placed for the commander of an army. Here, whenever chance or design gave him an opening, he was able to check the attacks of the barbarians from a position in their immediate neighbourhood. Before his coming, his reputation for violent temper made him an object of terror to all, and it was expected that he would at once punish the officers whose disloyalty or withdrawal had exposed the flank of Pannonia. Once he arrived, however, he became so lukewarm that he made no inquiry into the murder of King Gabinius, and took no serious steps to discover whose neglect or slackness it was that had led to the infliction of such wounds on the Roman state. It was in fact his way to show great severity in punishing the rank and file, but to be more lenient towards persons of high rank, even when they deserved a severe reprimand. The only man whom he pursued with active hatred was Probus. From the moment he set eyes on him, he never ceased to threaten him remorselessly, and he had obvious strong grounds for doing so. Probus had then achieved the prefectship, not for the first time, and was eager to prolong his tenure, if only the various means which he employed to this end had been respectable. Instead, however, of following the exalted traditions of his family, he proved more of a toady than a man of honour. Realizing that the emperor's settled policy was to find means of getting money from every quarter without regard for right or wrong, he made no attempt to bring his misguided master back to the path of justice, as prudent statesmen have often done successfully. On the contrary, he followed him in the same tortuous and mistaken course. In consequence, those whom he ruled were grievously distressed. The imposition of ruinous taxes fatally sapped the resources of rich and poor alike. Long practice in oppression suggested a series of pretexts, each more powerful than the last. Finally, the burden of tribute and repeated increases in taxation caused such alarm that some members of the upper classes changed their places of residence. Others, squeezed by the harsh demands of the officials to a point where they could pay no more, became permanent inmates of prisons, and some of these grew tired of the light of day and found a welcome relief by hanging themselves. The corruption and ruthlessness of these proceedings were a matter of common and persistent report, but Valentinian's ears might have been stopped with wax. So little notice did he take. He was greedy of the most trivial gain, no matter from what source, and gave his attention only to what lay immediately before his eyes. Yet he might perhaps have spared Pannonia if he had heard earlier of these deplorable methods of raising money, which came to his notice only when it was much too late. The people of Epirus, like the rest of the provincials, were compelled by Probus to send a message to the emperor expressing their gratitude to the prefect, and a philosopher called Ipthicles, a man of proven strength of mind, was forced much against his will to undertake the errand. When he came before the Emperor, Valentinian recognized him and asked the nature of his mission. Iphicles answered in Greek and showed himself true to his philosophical principles. In reply to an explicit question whether those who sent him genuinely thought well of the prefect, he answered, "They sent me with groans and with great reluctance." These words cut Valentinian to the heart, and he set about tracking the course of the prefect like a keen scent hound, inquiring in his native tongue about people he knew. Where was so-and-so, for example, who enjoyed a great reputation among his countrymen, or such and such, who was a rich man, or some other leading character? When he was told that one had perished by the hangman's rope, that another had gone overseas, and that a third had killed himself or expired under the knot, he burst into a blaze of anger, to which fuel was added by Leo, master of the offices. Leo himself, I shudder to say, had designs on the prefectship, so that he might have further to fall. If he had obtained that office, he would have committed such excesses in comparison, the administration of Probus would have been praised to the skies. The emperor remained at Carnutum for 3 summer months, preparing equipment and supplies and intending to seize a favourable moment to attack the Quadi, the originators of this violent commotion. In this town, Faustinus, the nephew of the praetorian prefect Viventius, who was serving as a notary, was tortured and executed after a trial presided over by Probus. He was charged with having killed a donkey to further some magical operation. That was what his accusers alleged, but he maintained that he was merely manufacturing a specific to check the falling out of his hair. A further accusation designed to ruin him was that in answer to one Nigrinius, who was asking for an appointment as notary, he had laughingly responded, "If you want that, you must first make me emperor." This worst interpretation was placed on this jest, and Faustinus himself, together with Nigrinius and others, were tortured to death. Meribordes was sent ahead with the infantry under his command, and with Count Sebastian as his colleague, to ravage the country of the barbarians with fire and sword. Meanwhile, Valentinian himself quickly moved his camp to Budapest, where without loss of time he improvised a bridge of boats on which he crossed at a second point into the territory of the Quadi. The latter watched his approach from the rugged hills to which they had retired with their families. They had been uncertain what would happen, but were rooted to the spot in amazement when they saw the imperial standards actually on their soil. Valentinian marched rapidly forward as far as circumstances allowed, burning the dwellings and massacring regardless of age all whom his sudden onslaught caught still wandering at large. Then he returned without the loss of a man, and again spent some time at Aquincum. But autumn was passing quickly, as it does in a region usually frozen in the cold season, and he looked about for winter quarters. No suitable place presented itself except Savaria, though that too was in a weak state after a series of disasters. So setting the matter aside for the moment, important though it was, he set off with unabated energy and marched along the river. Leaving adequate garrisons for the forts and camps on his way, he reached Brigetio, where the fate long since ordained to put him to rest announced his approaching end by a series of portents. Very shortly before his arrival, comets blazed in the sky. These are a sign of the death of great persons, and I have already given an account of their origin. Previously at Sirmium, there was a sudden crash of thunder, and part of the palace, the council house, and the forum were struck by lightning. While he was still at Severia, an owl perched on the top of the royal bath uttering its fatal hoot, and could not be brought down by arrows and stones, though there was great competition to hit it. Further, when he was leaving the aforesaid city to take the field, he wished to do so by the gate by which he had entered, to obtain an omen that he would soon return to Gaul, but rubbish had been allowed to accumulate, and when this was cleared away, the united efforts of a large team could not shift an iron door which had fallen and blocked the entrance. To avoid wasting a day, the emperor had to leave by a different gate. On the night before the day which was to be his last, he had a dream, as sleepers often do. He saw his absent wife sitting with dishevelled hair, and dressed in mourning, and it was not hard to deduce that this gloomy-clad figure was his good fortune, which was about to desert him. Next morning he came out frowning and depressed. The horse that was brought him would not let him mount, but reared on its hind legs, which it had never done before. Valentinian, in a fit of his congenital fury, gave the savage order that the groom, whose support he had used in the usual way as he mounted, should have his right hand struck off. The innocent young man would have suffered this agonizing fate if Sorellis, the tribune of the stables, had not deferred the execution of this frightful sentence at the risk of his own life. The death of Valentinian. After this, the envoys of the Quadi appeared, humbly begging for peace and an amnesty for their past offences, and endeavouring to clear every obstacle from their path by promising to provide recruits and other services to the Roman state. Since lack of supplies and the unfavourable time of year made it impossible to harass them further, it was decided to receive them and to send them away with the armistice they were seeking. On the advice of Equitius, they were admitted to an audience and stood in a submissive attitude, paralysed with fear. When asked their errand, they produced excuses of the usual type, which they swore were genuine. They declared that the wrongs we had suffered had not been the result of any common resolve on the part of their leaders, and that it was bands of foreign brigands living near the river who were to blame for any hostile behaviour. They added, however, as a sufficient justification for what had happened, that the rage of the country folk had been aroused by the wrongful and untimely attempt to build a fort. This brought on a paroxysm of anger in Valentinian, and he began his answer boiling with fury. In noisy and abusive language he accused the whole nation of ingratitude and forgetfulness of past favours. He gradually grew calmer and was adopting a milder tone, when he was struck as if by lightning. His breathing and speech were obstructed, and a fiery flush overspread his face. Then his pulse failed, and he was drenched in a deadly sweat. To save him from falling to the ground before the eyes of the vulgar, his personal attendants rushed up and carried him to his private room. There he was laid on a bed. Though his breathing was very shallow, he did not lose consciousness. He recognised all the bystanders, whom the chamberlains had hastily collected in order to forestall any suspicion of foul play. His body was feverishly hot, and it was necessary to open a vein, but no medical man could be found to do this. They had all been sent by the emperor to various places to attend the troops who were suffering from the plague. At last, however, a surgeon was found, but though he made several incisions, he could not extract a drop of blood. Either the organs were burnt up by excessive heat, or else, as some thought, the body was dehydrated because some passages, which we now call blood vessels, were blocked and clotted by the bitter cold. Valentinian realised from the fearful severity of the attack that his last moment had come. He tried to speak or give some order. This was clear from the gasps that racked his sides, and from the way in which he ground his teeth, and made movements with his arms as if he were boxing. Finally, he could do no more. His body was covered with livid spots, and after a long struggle he breathed his last. He was 54 years old and had reigned for 100 days short of 12 years. The parentage and reign of Valentinian. It is now the moment to recapitulate, as I have in other cases, and to give a brief summary of the history of the emperor from his father's birth to his own death. I shall not fail to distinguish his good and bad qualities, which his high station placed in a strong light. Such a position always reveals a man's true nature. The elder Gratian was born of humble stock at Cybele, a town in Pannonia. From early boyhood he was nicknamed Ropeman because while still young he successfully resisted the strenuous efforts of 5 soldiers to wrest him from a rope which he was carrying around for sale. He was in fact a second Milo of Croton, who would often hold an apple in his right or left hand, from which no degree of force availed to wrench it. Gratian's physical strength and skill at wrestling in the soldier's fashion made him widely known, and after serving successfully as staff officer and tribune, he commanded the army in Africa with the rank of count. He left this post under a cloud, having incurred a suspicion of theft, but much later he was commander-in-chief in Britain, with the same rank, and finally received an honourable discharge and returned home. While he was living quietly in retirement, his property was confiscated by Constantius on the alleged ground that during the civil war he had hospitably entertained Magnentius, when the latter crossed his land on his way to his objective. His father's services caused Valentinian to be favourably regarded from his early years, and his own merits contributed to enhance his reputation. In consequence, he was invested with the imperial purple at Nicaea and took as his colleague his brother Valens, who was very close to him in sentiment as well as in blood. Valens' character, as I shall demonstrate in due course, exhibited a mixture of good and bad qualities. Valentinian, before he was emperor, had encountered many dangerous situations, and at the beginning of his reign he made for Gaul to strengthen the fortresses and cities lying near the rivers. Gaul was exposed to the attacks of the Alemanni, who took new heart when they heard of the death of the Emperor Julian, the only commander since Constans of whom they were afraid. Valentinian, however, also made himself deservedly dreaded. He strongly reinforced the army and fortified the high ground on both banks of the Rhine with strong points and castles, so that no assault on our territory could be launched unobserved. I will pass over a number of measures taken by Valentinian once his authority was established, either in person or through the agency of efficient subordinates. After taking his son Gratian as his partner in power, he caused Vadomar's son Vithicab, the king of the Alemanni, to be assassinated, since he could not bring about his death openly. Vithicab was in the first bloom of manhood and was inciting his peoples to unrest and war. In a fight with the Alemanni near Cilicium, Valentinian fell into an ambush and almost lost his life, but he would have destroyed the enemy to a man if a few had not saved themselves by swift flight under the cover of darkness. Another instance of his prudent conduct of war was this. The Saxons, in a mood of appalling fury, overran the coastal region. It was their way to make sudden descents on impulse in any direction. On this occasion they had almost got away with a rich haul of booty, but Valentinian, by a perfidious yet successful stratagem, destroyed them and stripped the vanquished brigands of their spoil. Again, when the Britons were unable to resist the hordes of enemies infesting their country, he gave them hope of a better future and restored peace and freedom, allowing hardly any of the aggressors to return home. With like vigour he nipped in the bud the attempt of the exiled Pannonian Valentinius to disturb the public peace in that province. He also saved Africa from great danger at a time when it had been struck by a sudden calamity, Firmus having raised a rebellion of the Moorish tribes, which are susceptible to the least breath of sedition. Because he could not endure the greed and arrogance of the military, he would have shown similar resolution in avenging the lamentable disasters in Illyricum had not death supervened and compelled him to leave that important task unfinished. The successes I have mentioned were admittedly the work of his excellent generals, but the personal exploits of a man of such quick understanding and long military experience were undoubtedly numerous. Among these, none would have been more glorious than to take that formidable figure, King Marcellinus, alive. Valentinian made great efforts to do this. When he heard, to his distress and sorrow, that Marcellinus had escaped from the Burgundians, whom he had himself put in motion against the Alemanni, Valentinian's cruelty, greed, jealousy, and timidity. This is a brief summary of the emperor's achievements. Now, in the belief that posterity, being free from the constraints of fear and shameful servility, is an impartial judge of the past, I will enumerate Valentinian's defects and follow them by an account of his good qualities. He occasionally feigned mildness, although his naturally hot temper made him more prone to severity. He forgot that the ruler of an empire should shun all extremes like a precipice. He was never content with a slight punishment, and often ordered a proliferation of bloody trials, in which some people were brought to death's door by grim tortures. His propensity to inflict injury was so excessive that he never commuted the sentence of anyone condemned to death, though even the cruelest rulers have occasionally done so. Both at home and abroad he could have found many past examples of humanity and compassion to imitate, qualities which philosophers call kindly sisters of the virtues. Of these it will be enough to cite the following. Artaxerxes, the great king of Persia, called Longhand because of the length of one limb, was so mild-tempered that he mollified the various punishments which that rude people was in the habit of inflicting. In the case of some criminals he cut off their turbans instead of their heads, and instead of cropping men's ears for their offences in the regular royal way, he sheared off their strings hanging from their fur caps. This merciful behaviour won him such acceptance and respect from his subjects that, with their unanimous support, he performed a number of wonderful feats which are chronicled by the writers of Greece. In one of the Samnite wars, a magistrate of Praeneste, who had been slack in obeying an order to hurry to his post, was brought out to expiate his offence. Papirius Cursor, who was then dictator, caused the lictor to make ready his axe, and then, when the panic-stricken officer had abandoned all hope of reprieve, ordered a bush nearby to be cut down. By this practical joke the praetor was both punished and exonerated, but far from being despised for it, Papirius got the upper hand in a long hard war inherited from his fathers, and was reputed to be the only man who could have resisted Alexander the Great if he had set foot on Italian soil. Perhaps it was because he was ignorant of these precedents and failed to reflect that if a merciful disposition in a ruler is always a comfort in distress, then Valentinian reinforced his punishments by the use of fire and sword, which to virtuous minds are the last resort in adversity. Isocrates makes this point in a fine passage, in which he maintains in imperishable words that a defeated commander is sometimes more worthy of pardon than one who does not know what is right. It was this thought, I believe, that inspired Cicero's noble statement in his defence of Oppius. To be strong enough to save another has often been thought honourable, but it has never been a disgrace to be too weak to destroy him. Greed for gain, regardless of right and wrong, and eagerness to find new ways of enriching himself by the ruin of others, welled up in this emperor and burned ever fiercer. Some tried to justify this by the example of the Emperor Aurelian, who, finding the treasure exhausted after the deplorable events of the reign of Gallienus, fell upon the rich like a tidal wave. In the same way, they argued Valentinian after the disasters of the Parthian campaign had to find immense sums to reinforce and pay his troops. This accounted for the mixture of greed and cruelty which he amassed great resources with, affecting not to know that there are some things which one ought not to do even though one has the power. In this he was very unlike Themistocles. The later, after the battle with the Persians and the destruction of their army, was strolling over the battlefield when he saw some golden bracelets and a collar lying on the ground. He turned to one of his companions and said, "You may take them, since you are not Themistocles," implying that personal gain was beneath the dignity of a self-respecting commander. Examples of similar restraint can be found in abundance in Roman generals. These I will pass over. They are not proofs of perfect virtue, since, after all, it is not particularly praiseworthy to keep one's hands off of the property of others. I will, however, give one instance among many of the honesty of common folk in early times. When Marius and Cinna left the rich dwellings of the proscribed to be plundered by the commons of Rome, the mob, which for all its roughness had a respect for human rights, forbade to touch the fruits of other men's labours. Even among the poor and people of the lowest class, no one could bring himself to take advantage of permission to enrich himself by the miseries of his countrymen. Furthermore, this emperor in his innermost heart was consumed with envy, and knowing that most vices can generally masquerade as virtues, was apt to say that jealousy is the inseparable associate of the severity inherent in lawful power. Men in supreme positions, believing that they are above the law, are inclined to suspect those who oppose them, and to remove from their neighbourhood anyone better than themselves. So Valentinian hated the well-dressed, the educated, the rich, and the highly born, and disparaged the brave, wishing to monopolize all good qualities for himself, a fault which we are told was glaringly apparent in the Emperor Hadrian. This same prince was in the habit of abusing timid persons, calling them dirty rascals for whom no degradation was bad enough, yet he himself sometimes turned abjectly pale at the thought of imaginary terrors, and was inwardly afraid of non-existent bogies. The Master of Offices, Remigius, was well aware of this, and when he saw that something had put the emperor in a passion, used to throw out a casual hint of a rising among the barbarians. The mere mention of this caused Valentinian such alarm that he became as mild and merciful as Antoninus Pius. He never deliberately appointed brutal officials, but if he heard that some of his nominees were behaving with cruelty, he would boast that he had found men to rival Lycurgus and Crassus, those pristine pillars of justice, and would constantly urge them in writing to visit even trivial offences with severity. Those who fell on hard times found no refuge in the kindness of the emperor, though in the past this had always offered a welcome haven to life's shipwrecked mariners. For as philosophy tells us, the goal of a just reign should be the safety and welfare of its subjects, it is fitting to turn next to those of his actions which deserve the approval and imitation of right-thinking men. If he had regulated the rest of his conduct by the same standard of life, would have been like those of Trajan and Marcus Aurelius. He treated the provincials indulgently and everywhere lightened the burden of tribute. He met a long-standing need by building towns and fortifying frontiers. He was admirably strict in enforcing military discipline. His only defect was that while he punished even trivial offences in the rank and file, he allowed grave faults in their superiors to grow unchecked, and often turned a deaf ear to the complaints brought against them. This led to disturbances in Britain, Africa, and Illyricum. He was entirely chaste in his personal life both at home and abroad, and kept himself unspotted by any taint of obscenity or impurity. In consequence, he kept a tight rein on the wantonness of the imperial court, which he was able to control the more easily because he never showed indulgence to his own relations. They were either kept in retirement or given posts of no great importance. The sole exception was his brother, whom the exigencies of the time compelled him to take as his colleague in supreme power. He was most careful in making appointments to high positions. In his reign no one engaged in finance governed a province, and no office was put up for sale except in his early days, a period when some crimes are often committed in the hope that the emperor will be too busy to punish them. In wars both offensive and defensive he showed great skill and caution, being steeled to endure the dust of battle. He was prudent in urging the right course and depreciating the reserve. And he kept a keen eye on all ranks in the service. He wrote a good hand, and was an accomplished painter and modeller, and invented new weapons. His memory was good and his speech vigorous, though he seldom approached eloquence. He loved elegant simplicity and took pleasure in tasteful but not profuse entertainments. In the last place, his reign was distinguished for religious tolerance. He took a neutral position between opposing faiths and never troubled anyone by ordering him to adopt this or that mode of worship. He made no attempt to fasten his own beliefs on the necks of his subjects, but left the various cults undisturbed as he found them. His frame was strong and muscular, and he had gleaming hair and a high complexion. His eyes were grey with a stern sidelong glance. He was of a good height and perfectly well built, and all in all presented a splendid figure as an emperor. The younger Valentinian is proclaimed emperor. When the last tributes of grief had been paid, the emperor's body was prepared for burial and dispatched to Constantinople to lie among the remains of his predecessors. The impending campaign was postponed, and anxious fears were felt about the attitude of the Gallic troops, who were not always loyal to the lawful princes and regarded themselves as arbiters in the choice of an emperor. It was thought that they might take the opportunity of attempting a coup, especially as they had the additional inducement that Gratian, who knew nothing of what had happened, was still at Trier, where his father had stationed him when he set out on his own campaign. While things were in this critical state, there was general alarm. All felt that they were in the same boat and likely to share in any danger that arose. Finally, the highest-ranking officers decided that the bridge erected by Valentinian for his invasion of the enemy's territory should be dismantled, and that Meribordes should be immediately recalled in Valentinian's name, as if he were still living. Meribordes was shrewd enough to guess what had happened, or possibly was informed by the courtier who summoned him. Suspecting that the Gallic troops would break their oaths of loyalty, he pretended that he had received a signal to return with the bearer to guard the banks of the Rhine against a growing barbarian threat. In accordance with secret instructions, he removed Sebastian, who was still unaware of the emperor's death, to a distant post. He was a quiet and peaceful man, but very popular with the troops, and needed therefore to be closely watched. On Meribordi's return, and after the most careful deliberation, it was proposed that young Valentinian, the 4-year-old son of the deceased, should be sent for and co-opted emperor. He was 100 miles away, living with his mother Justina in a country house called Merosintina. The proposal met with unanimous assent, and Seralis, the boy's uncle, was sent to fetch him at once. He was put in a litter and brought to the camp, and 6 days after his father's death he was formally proclaimed emperor. At the time it was thought that Gratian might take it amiss that another emperor had been installed without his permission, but later this anxiety was dispelled and peace of mind returned. Gratian, who was a kindly and dutiful man, treated his kinsman with great affection and supervised his upbringing.